Panic wears a tailored suit better than most emotions. It hides in the micro-adjustments of a silk tie, the forced steadiness of manicured hands resting on imported Italian leather, the practiced smile that doesn't quite reach the eyes. Darian Ashford had perfected that smile over 7 years of board meetings, investor pitches, and magazine covers that called him a visionary. Today, sitting at the head of his glass conference table on the 42nd floor of the Nexus Data headquarters, that smile felt like it might crack his face open. The numbers glowing on the projection screen were a slow-motion car crash, revenue down 38% quarter over quarter, client retention at 62% and falling. The enterprise contracts that had made Nexus Data a darling of the tech world were evaporating like morning fog under a merciless sun. His chief financial officer, a sharp-eyed woman named Petra, who had stopped pretending to be reassuring 3 months ago, was walking the board through the carnage with clinical precision. Darian adjusted his Tom Ford tie, charcoal gray, $3,000 a gift from his wife Sienna, who had excellent taste in expensive things, and let his gaze drift to the floor-to-ceiling windows. Manhattan sprawled below him, all steel and glass, and the arrogant permanence of money. He had conquered this city once. The memory felt like it belonged to someone else. His phone buzzed against the table. A text from Sienna dinner at Maria. 8 p.m. Don't be late. Dad wants to talk. Preston Blackwell wanting to talk was never good news. Darian's father-in-law had the emotional warmth of a Wall Street trading algorithm and the mercy of a loan shark. The man had pumped $40 million into Nexus Data's Series B round 5 years ago, back when Darian was the golden boy who could do no wrong. That investment had tripled on paper during the IPO. On paper, now those shares were worth less than the mahogany desk Preston probably kept them filed under. The boardroom doors opened with a whisper of expensive hinges. Darian's executive assistant, Rebecca Young, efficient, terrified of him in exactly the right way, appeared in the doorway. Her face had gone the color of printer paper. "Mr. Ashford, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but there's someone here to see you. She says it's urgent." Petra stopped mid-sentence about liquidity ratios. The board members, 8 people who had collectively made hundreds of millions betting on Darian's genius, turned to stare. "I'm in the middle of a quarterly review, Rebecca. Unless the building is on fire." She says her name is Alara Whitmore. The name hit Darian like a fist to the solar plexus. For exactly 3 seconds, the world stopped spinning. He felt his carefully constructed composure fracture, then reconstitute itself through sheer force of will. When he spoke, his voice came out flat, controlled the tone of a man who had just been told his parking meter expired. "That's not possible." Rebecca's hands were shaking. She was holding a slim leather portfolio, the kind expensive lawyers carried. "She's waiting in the reception area. She has 2 gentlemen with her. Security tried to..." She showed them documentation. Building management confirmed. As of 8 o'clock this morning, the deed to this tower was transferred to a corporation called Vanguard Holdings. Darian stood up slowly. The leather chair made a soft, protesting sound. "What the hell are you talking about?" "The woman says Vanguard Holdings owns the building now. She says security works for her." Preston Blackwell, sitting 3 chairs down from Darian, set down his fountain pen with a click that echoed in the sudden silence. The old man's eyes had gone very sharp, the way they did when he smelled blood in the water. "Ashford, who is Alara Whitmore?" Darian's throat had gone dry. His mind was racing through possibilities, each one more insane than the last. Alara Whitmore was supposed to be gone. Erased. A footnote in his origin story, the kind of detail you left out when journalists asked how you built your empire. 5 years ago, she had walked out of his life with a $50,000 check and a restraining order's worth of bitterness. She had been broken, defeated. He had watched her sign away everything that mattered and then watched her disappear into the gray anonymity of New York's invisible poor. "She's nobody," Darian heard himself say. "An ex-wife. This is clearly some kind of stunt. Rebecca, called building security. Have her removed." "Sir, she has the deed. Legal counsel for Vanguard Holdings is with her. They're not trespassing." "Technically, we are." The word technically hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Darian looked at Preston. The old man's expression had shifted from irritation to cold calculation. Preston Blackwell had survived 4 decades on Wall Street by reading situations faster than other men could blink. Whatever he saw in Darian's face right now was making him very, very interested. "I think," Preston said quietly, We should meet this ex-wife of yours. 7 years ago, Alara Whitmore had believed in fairy tales. Not the Disney kind with singing mice and magical pumpkins, but the adult version, the myth that hard work and loyalty and love could build something permanent. That if you poured your genius into another person's dream, you became part of that dream. That partnership meant something more than a signature on a marriage certificate. She had been 25 years old, fresh out of MIT, with a degree in computer science and a specialty in cryptographic algorithms that made her professors use words like revolutionary and once in a generation. The tech world had been hers for the taking. Google had made an offer. So had Apple. A small security firm in Tel Aviv had offered her a lead architect position with stock options that would have made her a millionaire before 30. She had turned them all down for a man with good hair and better promises. Darian Ashford had walked into the Brooklyn Tech Incubator on a Thursday afternoon in March with a pitch deck and a smile that could sell him ice to penguins. His idea was elegant, a cloud-based data synchronization platform that could handle enterprise-level security without sacrificing speed. In theory, it solved a problem that had plagued corporate IT departments for a decade. In practice, it required someone who could write code that didn't exist yet. Alara had been sitting in the back of the room during his presentation, laptop open, half listening, while she debugged a personal project. She remembered the exact moment she looked up and met his eyes. He had been explaining the technical architecture, badly using metaphors that made her wince, and then he had stopped. Mid-sentence, smiled at her with a kind of helpless charm and said, "I have no idea what I'm talking about, do I?" The room had laughed. Alara had found herself smiling despite her better judgment. After the pitch, he had found her at the coffee station. "You're the one who knows what I'm trying to build, aren't you?" She had stirred sugar into her coffee, avoiding his eyes. "Your security model has 3 fundamental flaws. Your encryption protocol would take about 6 hours to crack and with a decent quantum processor. And your data synchronization algorithm would create bottlenecks that would crash the system the moment you scaled past 10,000 users." Instead of looking offended, he had laughed. "So you can fix it. I could rebuild it from scratch. How long would that take? 2 years if I worked alone, 18 months if you let me bring in a team." He had leaned against the counter close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and understated. "What if I told you I don't have 18 months? What if I told you I have 6 months to deliver a working prototype to an investor who's already committed $5 million based on promises I can't keep without someone like you?" She should have walked away. Every instinct, honed by 4 years at MIT, every warning her thesis advisor had given her about charismatic founders and broken promises told her to finish her coffee and forget she ever met Darian Ashford. Instead, she had said, "I tell you that you're either very brave or very stupid. Can it be both?" That was how it started. A partnership built on mutual need and late nights and the dangerous intimacy of 2 people building something from nothing. Darian handled the investors, the press, the endless theater of selling a product that didn't exist yet. Alara handled everything else. She wrote code until her eyes burned and her fingers cramped. She built the encryption protocols, designed the synchronization algorithms, created the security architecture that would eventually make Nexus data worth $250 million. Somewhere in the second-year, partnership became something else. Darian started staying at her apartment after their work sessions, stretched out on her couch with his laptop reading term sheets and investor agreements while she coded. They ordered takeout at midnight and argued about features and fell asleep with their laptops still open. One night, she looked up from her screen and found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What? I don't know how I got this lucky," he had said. "Lucky how? Finding you, someone who sees what I see, someone who can actually make it real." She had felt something dangerous bloom in her chest, something that felt like hope. They got married 6 months before the IPO, small ceremony, immediate family only at a courthouse in Brooklyn. Alara wore a simple dress she bought at Bloomingdale's. Darian wore the same suit he wore to investor meetings. They exchanged vows that promised forever and partnership and all the beautiful lies people tell themselves when they're young and stupid and in love. The IPO made them rich. Not billionaire rich, not generational wealth, but enough to buy a penthouse in Manhattan and hire a housekeeper and stop checking prices at restaurants. Darian's face appeared on magazine covers. TechCrunch called him the next Zuckerberg. Forbes estimated his net worth at $75 million. Alara's name appeared in exactly one place, the employee directory listed as senior software architect. No magazine profiles, no conference keynotes. When journalists asked Darian about the technical genius behind Nexus Data, he smiled his practiced smile and said something vague about an incredible team of engineers. She had told herself it didn't matter. They were partners. What was his was hers. The spotlight made him uncomfortable anyway, and he needed to be the face of the company. Someone had to charm the investors and handle the press. That was his gift. Her gift was the code. She had believed that right up until the Tuesday in November when she'd walked into his office unannounced and found him with his shirt unbuttoned and Sienna Blackwell straddling his lap on the leather couch. The bottle of 20-year-old scotch she had been carrying, a celebration gift for closing their latest funding round, slipped from her fingers. The glass exploded against the hardwood floor with a sound like a gunshot. Amber liquid spread across the Italian leather of her boots, but Alara couldn't look away from the scene in front of her. Sienna Blackwell was 26 years old, blonde, in the way that required a team of professionals and a trust fund, with the kind of beauty that came from good genes and better cosmetic dermatology. She was also the daughter of Preston Blackwell, the man who had written a $40 million check to keep Nexus Data afloat during a rough quarter 2 years ago. For exactly 3 seconds, nobody moved. Alara's brain was struggling to process the image, to reconcile it with the reality she had been living. Then Sienna laughed a bright, careless sound and climbed off Darian's lap, reaching for her silk blouse. "I'll let you two talk," she said, buttoning the blouse without any apparent embarrassment. She brushed past Alara, trailing expensive perfume. "See you at dinner, babe." The door clicked shut behind her. Darian stood up slowly, methodically buttoning his shirt. His face showed no panic, no guilt, no shame, just mild irritation, like she had interrupted an important meeting. "You should have knocked, Alara." Her voice came out smaller than she wanted. "How long? Does it matter? How long?" He walked to his desk, poured himself water from a crystal decanter. 18 months, give or take. Preston was concerned about the company's direction. Sienna joined the board as his representative. We got close. 18 months, a year and a half. While Alara had been hosting dinner parties for investors, while she had been sitting through charity galas, holding Darian's hand, while she had been playing the role of supportive wife, he had been fucking the daughter of their primary stakeholder. "Darian, I built this company. I wrote every line of code that made Nexus possible. I spent 3 years." "You wrote some scripts," he interrupted, his voice taking on an edge she had never heard before. "About 6 years ago, the company has evolved far beyond that initial work. We have an entire engineering department now, 23 developers. What you did was foundational, sure, but it was also a long time ago." Well, the casual dismissal of 3 years of her life, 3 years of 16-hour days, and sacrificed opportunities and poured out genius hit her like a physical blow. "I am not some entry-level engineer, Darian. I designed the security architecture. I built the synchronization algorithm. Everything Nexus Data does, everything that made you rich, runs on foundations I created." He set down the water glass. When he looked at her, his eyes were cold. "Let's not do the hysterics. You knew this marriage was a business arrangement as much as anything else. I needed technical expertise in the early days. You provided that. But I'm the one who raised the capital. I'm the one who closed the deals. I'm the one whose face investors trust. I loved you." The words came out broken, pathetic. She hated herself for saying them. Darian's expression didn't change. "I needed you. There's a difference. And frankly, I don't need you anymore. The technical problems are solved. What I need now are connections." Sienna brings connections. Her father controls $300 million in investment capital. "Do you know what that means for this company?" "This company," her voice was rising, control slipping. "The company built on my code. The company that wouldn't exist if I hadn't spent 3 years staring at a screen while you played golf with investors." He laughed. It was the cruelest sound she had ever heard. "Your code. Listen to yourself. You sound delusional. Nexus Data is a machine, Alara. I am the engine. I am the face. I am the mind that built this empire. You were," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "a useful early employee who happened to be sleeping with the CEO. If you want to walk away, walk. But don't stand there and pretend you built my empire. The absolute erasure of her sacrifice, the casual cruelty in his voice broke something fundamental inside Alara's chest. She felt it crack, felt years of trust and partnership and love shatter into something sharp and dangerous. She turned and walked out, leaving the shattered scotch bottle behind. Her hands were shaking. Her vision had gone blurry. With tears she refused to let fall until she was alone. In the elevator descending to the lobby, something changed. The crushing sorrow hardened, crystallized, turned into something colder and infinitely more patient. By the time the elevator doors opened to the street level, Alara Whitmore had stopped crying. The divorce was a masterpiece of legal violence. Darian had hired Simon Thorne, a lawyer whose reputation preceded him like a death sentence. Thorne was the man you called when you wanted to win and you didn't care about collateral damage. His hourly rate was $1,500. His success rate in high-asset divorce cases was 97%. Alara walked into the first meeting with a public defender she had scraped together money to afford. His name was Martin Reeves, and he looked exhausted before the proceedings even started. The conference room was aggressively neutral: gray walls, gray carpet, a long gray table surrounded by ergonomic chairs that cost more than Alara's monthly rent in the studio apartment she had moved into after walking out of the penthouse. Thorne sat at one end of the table with a stack of leather folders. Darian sat next to him, checking his phone, radiating bored impatience. Thorne opened the first folder without preamble. "Mrs. Ashford, let's establish the facts. You and Mr. Ashford were married for 3 years. During that time, Mr. Ashford founded and built Nexus Data Incorporated, which is currently valued at $250 million. You were employed by Nexus Data as a senior software architect with an annual salary of $120,000, which you received until you voluntarily resigned 6 weeks ago." "I didn't resign voluntarily. I was constructively dismissed after We have your resignation letter." Thorne continued, sliding a document across the table. "Signed by you. No mention of dismissal, constructive or otherwise." Alara stared at the letter. She had signed it in Darian's office 2 days after finding him with Sienna, when he had calmly explained that her continued presence at the company would create an uncomfortable environment for essential stakeholders. He had offered her 3 months severance if she went quietly. She had been too shocked, too emotionally destroyed to fight. Martin cleared his throat. "My client's employment status is not the primary issue here. Mrs. Ashford contributed significantly to the intellectual property that forms the foundation of Nexus Data. She is entitled to compensation reflecting that contribution." Thorne smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "Let's address that claim." He opened a second folder. "This is the intellectual property assignment agreement signed by Mrs. Ashford on August 14th, 3 years ago. It clearly states that any work product created during her employment with Nexus Data becomes the sole property of the company." Furthermore, he produced another document. This is a separate EP transfer deed signed by Mrs. Ashford on December 2nd, 2 years ago, explicitly transferring ownership of the foundational algorithms and security protocols she developed to a subsidiary corporation wholly owned by Mr. Ashford personally. Alara felt the blood drain from her face. "What I never thought." Thorne slid the document across to her. At the bottom, in blue ink, was her signature. The memory hit her like ice water. December 2 years ago. They had been packing for a vacation to St. Bart's. Darian had rushed into the bedroom with a stack of papers, said something about year-end tax documents that needed signatures before they left. She had been folding clothes, distracted, happy. She had signed without reading. "That's not," her voice cracked. "I didn't know what I was signing. He told me they were tax forms." Thorne's expression didn't change. "The document is notarized. Your signature is witnessed. Whether you read it carefully or not is not my client's responsibility." Martin was flipping through the papers, his face growing paler with each page. "This can't be legal. This is fraud." "Nothing fraudulent about it," Thorne said. "Every document was properly executed. Mrs. Ashford signed willingly. If she failed to exercise due diligence in understanding what she signed, that's unfortunate, but it's not grounds to invalidate a legal contract. She built that company," Martin said, his voice taking on a desperate edge. "She wrote the code. She designed the architecture. Without her work, Nexus Data wouldn't exist." Thorne steepled his fingers. "Let me be very clear about the situation. Mrs. Ashford has no ownership stake in Nexus Data. She has no claim to the intellectual property. The prenuptial agreement she signed, he produced yet another document, explicitly states that she waives all rights to assets acquired post-marriage under Mr. Ashford's name. In this jurisdiction, that means she is entitled to a one-time equitable distribution payment of $50,000 in the vehicle registered in her name. That's it. $50,000. Alara's voice came out as a whisper. I spent 3 years building that company. You spent 3 years employed by that company, Thorne corrected, for which you were compensated with a salary and benefits. The company's subsequent success is due to Mr. Ashford's leadership and vision. Darian finally looked up from his phone. He met Alara's eyes across the table, and the emptiness she saw there made her stomach turn. Take the deal, Alara. If you fight this, I will drag it out for years. I will spend whatever it takes. I will bankrupt you in legal fees before you ever see a courtroom. You have no leverage here. Be smart for once in your life. Martin tried. Over the next 6 weeks, he filed motions and drafted arguments and called in favors from colleagues who specialized in intellectual property law. But Thorne had built an impenetrable fortress of paperwork. Every document was airtight. Every signature was valid. The prenuptial agreement was unassailable. In the end, Alara signed the settlement. She walked out of Thorne's office with a cashier's check for $50,000 and the keys to a 5-year-old Audi that needed new tires. The penthouse went to Darian. The investment accounts went to Darian. The vacation home in the Hamptons went to Darian. Everything she had helped build, every sacrifice she had made, every late night and lost opportunity, all of it vanished into the legal fiction that she had merely been an employee who happened to be married to the founder. 3 months later, Darian and Sienna Blackwell got married at a vineyard in Napa Valley. Vogue covered the wedding. The photos showed Sienna in a Vera Wang gown, Darian and Tom Ford, both of them radiating the smug satisfaction of people who had won. Alara saw the photos on a newsstand in Queens while walking home from the grocery store. She stood on the sidewalk with a bag of discount pasta and wilting vegetables, staring at the glossy magazine, and felt absolutely nothing. The numbness lasted for 6 months. She rented a studio apartment in a building where the radiator clanked all night and the smell of old cigarettes had soaked into the walls. The $50,000 evaporated faster than she expected. First and last month's rent, security deposit, a laptop to replace the one she'd had to return to Nexus Data, food utilities, the creeping expenses of staying alive in New York City. She sold her jewelry, then her designer clothes. Then the Audi, which fetched less than she hoped because of the needed repairs. She applied to tech jobs, but her resume had a 3-year gap filled only with Nexus Data. And when recruiters called for references, they got HR representatives who confirmed her employment dates and said nothing about her contributions. Without Darian's endorsement, without a portfolio, she legally couldn't claim she was just another engineer in a city full of them. Depression settled over her like a heavy blanket. She stopped answering her phone, stopped checking email, spent days lying in bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling, replaying every decision that had led her here. Every moment she could have chosen differently. Every warning sign she had ignored because she believed in partnership and love and the fairy tale that hard work mattered. On a Tuesday in January, 6 months after the divorce finalized, Alara pulled a cardboard box from the back of her closet. Inside was her old MIT laptop, battered, outdated, the stickers on the case faded from years of use. She plugged it in and listened to the fan word of life. She opened her old files. Code she had written as a student, projects from her thesis, the early prototypes of the algorithms that had eventually become Nexus Data's foundation. She read through the architecture, tracing the logic she had built almost a decade ago. And as she read, something shifted in her chest. The numbness cracked. Underneath it was something she hadn't felt in months. Clarity. She saw the limitations of her old code, saw exactly where it would bottleneck as Nexus tried to scale beyond their current capacity, saw the fatal flaws Darian couldn't see because he didn't understand the machinery beneath his feet. She hadn't just built the foundation of Nexus Data. She had built something that would inevitably fail, and she knew exactly how and when it would collapse. More than that, she knew how to build something better. The next morning, Alara put on the only tailored suit she hadn't sold. She took the subway to Manhattan and walked into the lobby of Hale Capital Partners, a venture capital firm in Midtown. She waited in the reception area for 4 hours, watching analysts and partners flow in and out, until finally a sharp-eyed assistant approached her. "Ma'am, do you have an appointment? I need to speak with Grayson Hale." Mr. Hale doesn't take walk-in meetings. If you'd like to submit a pitch deck through our website, tell him Alara Whitmore is here. Tell him I was in his advanced cryptography seminar at MIT 9 years ago. Tell him I turned down the job offer he made me after graduation because I was young and stupid and in love. The assistant hesitated, then picked up her phone. 5 minutes later, Alara was escorted to the top floor. Grayson Hale's office looked like it had been designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows with a view of Central Park minimalist furniture that cost more than most people's cars, abstract art that was probably original. Hale himself sat behind a glass desk, silver-haired and sharp-featured, wearing a suit that fit like it had been grown specifically for his body. He looked up as Alara entered, and something like recognition flickered across his face. "Alara Bennett," he said, using her maiden name. "I heard about the divorce. Ugly business." She stopped in front of his desk. Her hands were steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "I'm here to make you $1 billion, Mr. Hale." Hale leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Bold opening. You have 2 minutes." Alara didn't sit down. "Nexus Data is running on an engine I built 7 years ago. They're putting new paint on a dying system. Darian doesn't have the technical depth to rebuild it from scratch because he doesn't understand the foundation. I do. Give me seed funding in 6 months and I'll build a platform that makes Nexus Data obsolete." "Revenge is expensive," Hale said, "and usually unsuccessful. This isn't revenge, Mr. Hale. It's a market correction. Nexus Data is going to fail within 3 years whether I do anything or not. I'm offering you the chance to profit from that failure." Hale studied her for a long moment. Then he smiled a sharp, predatory expression. "Tell me more." Grayson Hale's office at 7 in the evening felt different than it had at 2 in the afternoon. The winter sun had set hours ago, leaving Manhattan as a grid of lights against black sky. Alara sat across from him with her battered MIT laptop open, screencasting a pale glow on her face as she walked him through architecture diagrams that would have taken most engineers weeks to conceptualize. She had spent the past 4 hours explaining in granular detail exactly how Nexus Data would fail. Not speculation, not theory. Mathematical certainty backed by code analysis and predictive modeling. The synchronization algorithm she had built 7 years ago had a fundamental limitation. It prioritized speed over scalability. At 10,000 concurrent users, it hummed like a finely tuned engine. At 50,000, it would start to lag. At 100,000, the system would experience cascading failures that would crash enterprise networks. Nexus Data currently serves 73,000 active users across their client base. They were 18 months away from catastrophic failure, and Darian had no idea it was coming. Hale had stopped interrupting around the 2-hour mark. He sat with his fingers steepled, watching her with the intensity of a man who had built his fortune on recognizing genius when it walked through his door. "Show me the replacement architecture." Alara pulled up a different set of diagrams. What she had designed over the past 6 months wasn't an iteration of her old work. It was a complete reimagining. Machine learning algorithms that predicted data pathways before they were needed. Distributed processing that eliminated single points of failure. Encryption protocols that made Nexus Data's security look like a diary with a paper lock. I call it Sentinel Protocol. It doesn't just synchronize data, it anticipates it. Uses predictive modeling to pre-stage information before users even request it. Latency drops to near zero. Security increases by orders of magnitude, and it scales linearly. You could run 1 million users on the same infrastructure that chokes Nexus at 100,000. Hale leaned forward, studying the screen. "How long to build a working prototype?" 6 months with the right team, another 6 to polish it for enterprise deployment. "You said you need seed funding. How much?" 10 million, 5 for salaries and infrastructure, 5 for operating capital while we're in stealth mode. Stealth mode. Hale sat back, a slow smile spreading across his face. "You don't want to compete with Nexus Data publicly. You want to starve them. I want to be invisible until it's too late for them to react. By the time Darian realizes he has a competitor, I want Sentinel Protocol to be so deeply embedded in the enterprise market that Nexus Data looks obsolete." "That's not revenge talking." Alara met his eyes. "Revenge would be loud. This is surgery." Hale was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached for his phone and made a call. The conversation was brief, mostly numbers and dates. When he hung up, he looked at Alara with an expression that was part respect, part warning. I'll give you the 10 million. But we structure this carefully. You don't exist. The company doesn't exist. We create a shell corporation domiciled in Zurich, operated through layers of legal entities that make it impossible to trace back to you. You work out of a secure facility in Chicago, not here, not anywhere Darian might accidentally stumble across you. No press, no conferences, no social media. You become a ghost. Why Chicago? Because nobody builds tech companies in Chicago. Silicon Valley watches San Francisco, Seattle, Austin. Chicago is off the radar. And more importantly, I have a facility there that's already set up for classified contract work. Secure networks, clean rooms, the infrastructure you'll need without raising questions. Alara felt something settle in her chest, the first real breath she'd taken in 6 months. What's the equity split? Standard Series A terms. I take 30%, you keep 60, we leave 10% for an employee pool. When this works, if this works, you maintain control. But I sit on the board and I have veto rights over any decisions that could expose our position before we're ready. One more condition. Hale raised an eyebrow. I want complete autonomy on the technical side. You handle capital, legal structure, strategic positioning. I handle product development. No interference. I'm not a micromanager, Alara. I invest in people who know what they're doing. You clearly know what you're doing. He extended his hand across the desk. Do we have a deal? She shook his hand. His grip was firm, businesslike, the handshake of a man who had made and broken companies with similar gestures. One last thing, Hale added. There's a debugging subroutine in the Nexus data codebase. Something you embedded 7 years ago. I'm assuming it still exists. Alara went very still. How do you know about that? I've been watching Nexus data since their IPO. I funded a third-party security audit 2 years ago just to see how robust their infrastructure really was. My team found fragments of a dormant function buried in the synchronization engine. Elegantly written, impossible to detect without knowing exactly what to look for. It's not malicious code, more like a master key that never got removed during final production. It was a debugging tool. I used it during development to trace data flow without disrupting live operations. I was supposed to remove it before launch, but Darian was rushing to meet the IPO timeline. She stopped. The implications were settling over her like cold water. You're saying it's still there, still functional. And from what my team could reverse engineer, it would give someone with the right access keys complete administrative control over the Nexus data infrastructure. Not that I'm suggesting anything unethical, but it's interesting information to have. Alara stared at him. The debugging subroutine had been her safety net during development, a way to test changes in real time without breaking the system. She had forgotten about it in the chaos of the IPO preparation. But if it was still embedded in the production code, and if she still had the encryption keys, I'm not going to sabotage Nexus data. Of course not, Hale agreed. That would be illegal and unethical. But knowing you have leverage, real leverage, changes the psychology of the game. Darian Ashford thinks you're powerless. He's wrong. Remember that when things get difficult. The implication hung between them unsaid, but perfectly clear. Chicago in February was a special kind of hostile. Wind that cut through winter coats like they were made of tissue paper, snow that turned to gray slush. Within hours, a sky the color of old concrete. Alara arrived at the secure facility on a Tuesday morning with 2 suitcases containing everything she owned and a determination that felt like armor. The building was anonymous by design, a 5-story concrete structure in an industrial district near O'Hare, the kind of place that looked like a low-rent warehouse from the outside. Inside, it was a different world. Hale's people had built what amounted to a private tech campus, server rooms with redundant power supplies and military-grade security, clean rooms for hardware testing, office space that could house 30 engineers working in complete isolation from the outside world. Alara's office was on the top floor, a large open space with windows that had been treated with privacy, film making it impossible for anyone outside to see in while still letting natural light filter through. 3 curved monitors dominated a custom desk. A standing workstation occupied one corner. The walls were bare except for a single whiteboard that stretched 20 feet across. She unpacked her laptop, connected it to the secure network, and stared at that empty whiteboard for a long time. Building Sentinel protocol from scratch meant recruiting a team. But recruiting meant trusting people, and trust was a currency Alara no longer believed in. Hale had offered to bring in his own engineers, vetted professionals with security clearances, and ND as thick enough to stop bullets. She declined. If she was going to do this, she needed people who were hungry, people who had something to prove, people who would follow her into the fire because they believed in the mission, not the paycheck. She started with MIT, reached out through encrypted channels to professors she had stayed in contact with, asked for recommendations of recent graduates who showed exceptional promise but hadn't yet been snatched up by the big tech firms. Within 2 weeks, she had a list of 23 names. She interviewed them remotely, never showing her face, using voice modulation software to mask her identity. The questions weren't technical. She could assess their coding ability from their portfolios. What she wanted to know was whether they could handle uncertainty, whether they could work in the dark building, something they couldn't talk about for a company that officially didn't exist. 16 of them said no. 5 said maybe. 2 said yes without hesitation. The first was a 24-year-old named Kira Okafor, a Nigerian immigrant who had put herself through MIT working 3 jobs and graduated top of her class in distributed systems. She had rejected offers from Amazon and Facebook because, as she put it during the interview, "I don't want to spend my life optimizing ad targeting algorithms. I want to build something that matters." The second was Alexei Volkov, a Russian expat with a specialty in cryptographic protocols and a personal vendetta against insecure software. His sister had been a victim of a data breach 3 years ago. Medical records leaked online by hackers exploiting vulnerabilities in a hospital's cloud storage system. He had spent the last 2 years of his master's program designing encryption systems that would make similar breaches mathematically impossible. Alara brought them to Chicago on different days, had them sign ND, as that could bankrupt them for life if violated, and then showed them what they would be building. Kira's eyes went wide as she reviewed the architecture diagrams. This isn't incremental innovation. This is a paradigm shift. That's exactly what it is. Who are we competing against? Does it matter? Kira studied Alara's face, reading something in her expression that made her nod slowly. I guess it doesn't. When do we start? Alexei's reaction was different. He spent 2 hours in silence going through the security protocols, running mental simulations, testing the logic for weaknesses. Finally, he looked up. This encryption model, I've never seen anything like it. Where did you study? Same place you did. You went to MIT a long time ago. Then you know Professor Renwick. He teaches advanced cryptography. I had him for my thesis advisor. Alexei's expression shifted to something like awe. The Bennett cipher. You're Alara Bennett. You wrote the paper on quantum-resistant encryption that got published in the Journal of Cryptographic Research. It's still the standard reference for... He stopped. Wait, Bennett, you changed your name. I got married. And divorced, apparently. He gestured at the ring finger of her left hand, which was conspicuously bare. I'm guessing that's part of why we're building this in secret. Alara met his eyes. Can you work with that? Can I work with someone who wants to destroy their ex-husband's company using superior technology and surgical market strategy? Alexei smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. I can work with that just fine. Over the next 3 months, the team grew to 8. Each person carefully vetted, each one hungry in their own way. They worked 18-hour days in the sealed facility, writing code that wouldn't see the light of day for months. Alara drove them hard, harder than was fair, harder than was sustainable, but she drove herself harder. The Sentinel protocol took shape line by line, function by function. What had started as theoretical diagrams became working code. The synchronization engine that could handle exponential scale. The predictive algorithms that learned user behavior patterns. The security architecture that made intrusion not just difficult, but pointless. By month 6, they had a working prototype. By month 9, Alara was ready to start hunting. The enterprise software market operated on a currency of trust. Companies didn't switch platforms casually. The cost of migration, both financial and operational, created enormous inertia. To pull clients away from an established provider like Nexus Data, you needed to offer something so superior that the pain of change became worth it. Alara didn't go to the market directly. That would have been visible. Instead, she went to the Department of Defense. The DoD had been one of Nexus Data's flagship clients. A 5-year contract worth $40 million was to provide secure data synchronization for classified military communications. The contract was up for renewal in 8 months. Alara knew because she had designed the original system that Nexus Data's infrastructure barely met the DoD's current security requirements. As those requirements evolved, Darian would struggle to keep pace. She submitted a proposal through Phantom Systems, the shell corporation Hale had established. No company history, no marketing materials, just a technical specification document that outlined capabilities Nexus Data couldn't match and security guarantees they couldn't provide. The DoD's procurement office scheduled a demonstration. The meeting took place in a secure facility in Arlington, Virginia. Alara flew in with Alexei and Kira carrying nothing but encrypted laptops in a confidence born from knowing their product was untouchable. The procurement officers were skeptical. At first, Phantom Systems had no track record, no reputation, no reason to be taken seriously. Then Alara set up the demonstration. She showed them real-time synchronization across 100,000 simulated endpoints with zero latency. Showed them the encryption protocols that could withstand quantum computing attacks. Showed them how Sentinel protocol could integrate with legacy systems without requiring a complete infrastructure overhaul. The procurement officers stopped being skeptical around the 90-minute mark. The lead officer, a colonel named Patricia Brennan, who had spent 20 years in military IT, leaned back in her chair with an expression of profound irritation. "Where the hell did you people come from? We've been working quietly." "I can see that." Brennan gestured at the screen. "This is 2 generations ahead of what Nexus Data currently provides. Maybe 3. How long until you can deploy at scale? We can start integration within 30 days of contract signing." "That's aggressive. We've been preparing for this." Brennan exchanged glances with her fellow procurement officers. "I need to run this up the chain. But off the record, if your product performs as advertised, Nexus Data is going to lose this contract. And probably a few others once word gets around." Alara kept her expression neutral, professional. Inside, she felt something dark and hungry awaken. "We appreciate the opportunity to compete." The DoD contract came through 6 weeks later. $40 million over 5 years with performance bonuses that could push it to 50. The announcement was quite a brief press release that most of the tech world missed. Darian didn't miss it. 3 days after the announcement, Alara received an encrypted email from an anonymous sender. The message was brief. "Congratulations on the DoD contract." Nexus Data's stock dropped 8% on the news. D is furious and has no idea who Phantom Systems is. Thought you'd enjoy knowing that. GH. She deleted the email and got back to work. The healthcare sector fell next. Nexus Data had contracts with 3 of the largest hospital networks in the country, providing data synchronization for electronic medical records. It was lucrative business, and critically important hospital systems couldn't afford downtime or security breaches. Alara knew those systems intimately because she had built the integration protocols. She also knew their weaknesses. 6 months ago, she had quietly tipped off a white-hat security firm about potential vulnerabilities in Nexus Data's healthcare implementation. Not enough to cause actual harm, but enough to trigger security audits. Those audits had found problems. Minor ones mostly, but enough to make hospital administrators nervous. When Phantom Systems approached them with a proposal for a more secure alternative, they listened. St. Michael's Medical Center in Philadelphia was the first to switch. Then Presbyterian Hospital in New York. Then the entire Kaiser Permanente network on the West Coast. Each defection was a small cut. Individually, none of them would have destroyed Nexus Data. But Alara wasn't making individual cuts. She was creating a pattern of hemorrhaging that would slowly bleed the company dry. The financial sector was harder. Banks moved slowly, tied down by regulatory requirements and institutional paranoia. But they also cared about security more than anyone else. And Sentinel Protocol's cryptographic guarantees were mathematically provable in ways that Nexus Data couldn't match. Alara spent 3 months courting Wells Fargo's chief technology officer, a woman named Sandra Yates, who had survived 3 major data breaches in her career and had the scars to prove it. The pitch meeting took place in a conference room in San Francisco overlooking the bay. Yates cut straight to the point. "I've been doing some research on your company, Ms. Whitmore. Phantom Systems doesn't have a website, doesn't have a public-facing office. Your incorporation documents are a maze of shell companies that make it nearly impossible to figure out who actually owns you. Why should I trust a company that goes to such lengths to stay invisible? Because invisibility is the point. We don't need publicity. We need clients who care more about capability than reputation. Your current provider is Nexus Data. Their system has experienced 4 security incidents in the past 2 years. Minor ones, yes, but they're showing you a trend. We can demonstrate that our protocols make those incidents mathematically impossible. Nothing is mathematically impossible. Quantum-resistant encryption with rotating key architecture and distributed verification, it's as close to impossible as cryptography gets. Yates studied her. You're not a typical sales pitch. I'm not a typical vendor. No, you're not. Yates pulled up something on her tablet. I did more than research your company. I researched you. Alara Bennett, then Alara Ashford, now back to Alara Whitmore. MIT graduate thesis on advanced encryption. Married to Darian Ashford, founder of Nexus Data, divorced 3 years ago, and now you're building a company that's systematically poaching every major client Nexus Data has. Alara's expression didn't change. My personal history isn't relevant to whether Sentinel Protocol meets your security requirements. On the contrary, it's extremely relevant because it tells me you have a very personal motivation to succeed. That kind of motivation can be an asset or a liability depending on how stable you are. I'm stable enough to build a product that's superior to anything Nexus Data offers. The question is whether you care more about my motivations or your bank's security. Yates was quiet for a long moment. Then she smiled a sharp, knowing expression. I care about security. And frankly, after dealing with Darian Ashford's condescending account managers for 3 years, it would give me immense personal satisfaction to fire them. Show me a pilot deployment proposal and we'll talk numbers. The Wells Fargo contract was worth $30 million. 2.5 years after that meeting in Grayson Hale's office, Phantom Systems had contracts with the Department of Defense, 5 major healthcare networks, 3 of the largest banks in the country, and a dozen Fortune 500 companies that had quietly abandoned Nexus Data for a competitor most of the tech world had never heard of. Nexus Data's quarterly earnings reports told the story in stark numbers. Revenue down 42% year over year, client retention at 58%, stock price in free fall. The company that had once been valued at $250 million was now struggling to maintain a market cap above $70 million. Darian was drowning and he didn't know who was holding him underwater. Alara watched from Chicago as his empire crumbled. Not with satisfaction exactly, the emotion was more complex than that. There was a cold professional pride in the precision of her execution. But there was also something hollow about it, like winning a game nobody else knew they were playing. The final trap took a year to set. It required patience and perfect timing and a willingness to bet everything on a single move. Nexus Data was burning cash trying to compete with a ghost. Darian had poured money into acquiring smaller tech companies, hoping to buy the innovation he couldn't develop internally. He had taken on massive debt to finance those acquisitions. $500 million in loans from a consortium of banks, all secured against Nexus Data's assets. The debt covenants included performance benchmarks. If revenue dropped below certain thresholds, the banks could call the loans. Darian had missed those benchmarks twice in the past year. The banks were getting nervous. Alara had been watching those debt positions carefully, waiting for the right moment. That moment came on a Monday in November, 5 years to the month since she had walked into Darian's office and found him with Sienna. The banks holding Nexus Data's debt were shopping it, looking for someone willing to take the risk of Darian's collapsing company off their books. The debt was trading at 60 cents on the dollar. Banks would rather take a 40% loss now than risk a complete default later. Haley made the call from his office in New York while Alara listened on speakerphone from Chicago. We're buying it, all of it, every dollar of Nexus Data's debt. The bank's representative sounded confused. Mr. Hale, this is high-risk paper. Nexus Data could file for bankruptcy protection within the next 6 months. You'd be buying debt that might be uncollectible. I'm aware of the risk. Make the deal. We'll pay 65 cents on the dollar to close fast. You're offering a premium on distressed debt. I'm offering certainty. You get the debt off your books today, we assume all risk. Do we have a deal? They had a deal. By Wednesday afternoon, Vanguard Holdings, another shell corporation in the labyrinth of entities Hale had constructed, owned $520 million of Nexus Data's debt. Legally, they now held Darian Ashford's entire company by the throat. The acceleration clause in the loan documents was clear. If ownership of the debt transferred, the new holder could invoke immediate repayment of the full principal if the borrower had previously missed covenant benchmarks. Darian had missed two benchmarks. That gave Vanguard Holdings the legal right to call the debt immediately. $520 million due in full by close of business, Friday or Nexus Data, would be forced into liquidation. There was no way Darian could pay. His personal assets were tied up in real estate and investments that couldn't be liquidated in 3 days. The company's cash position was barely enough to cover 2 months of operating expenses. He was in every meaningful sense bankrupt. His only hope was to find a private equity firm willing to inject enough capital to restructure the debt. Someone who believed Nexus Data could be saved. Vanguard Holdings let it be known through intermediaries that they might be willing to restructure if the CEO of Vanguard could meet with Darian personally to discuss terms. Darian, desperate and running out of options, agreed immediately. The meeting was scheduled for Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock. Nexus Data Headquarters Executive Boardroom. Full board attendance requested. Alara flew to New York on Monday evening. She stayed at a hotel in Midtown under a fake name, barely slept, and spent the hours before dawn reviewing every detail of what was about to happen. This had to be perfect. No mistakes, no hesitation. At 9:30 Tuesday morning, she stood in the lobby of the building that used to house her husband's empire. The same lobby she had walked through 1,000 times. The same security desk where guards used to nod at her with recognition. Nobody recognized her now. She wore a Tom Ford suit, charcoal gray, $3,000, an intentional echo of Darian's favorite style. Her hair was pulled back severely. Her expression was the mask of a woman who had learned to show nothing. 2 men in dark suits flanked her. Hale's people brought in to handle any situation that might arise. They carried briefcases containing every legal document needed to execute what came next. The security guard checked her credentials. Alara Whitmore, CEO, Vanguard Holdings. He made a call, got confirmation, and waved her through to the executive elevators. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor felt like it took hours and seconds simultaneously. Alara's heart was steady. Her hands were steady. Everything inside her that had once been soft and trusting and vulnerable had been refined into something harder than diamond. The elevator doors opened. She walked down the corridor toward the boardroom, each step measured and deliberate. Through the glass walls, she could see them waiting, Darian at the head of the table. Preston Blackwell, looking old and tired, Sienna checking her phone with studied disinterest, 12 board members who had bet their fortunes on a man who was about to lose everything. Alara reached the heavy mahogany doors, placed her hand on the brass handle, took one breath. Then she pushed the doors open and walked into the room where her marriage had died, ready to finish what she had started 5 years ago. The boardroom fell silent the moment Alara crossed the threshold. 14 faces turned toward her in synchronized shock, as if someone had pressed pause on a film. The mahogany doors swung shut behind her with a whisper that felt louder than thunder. Darian's practiced smile, the one that had charmed investors and closed deals, and convinced Alara 7 years ago that he was worth believing in, fractured like thin ice. His face went through a rapid sequence of expressions, confusion, recognition, disbelief, and finally a flash of something that looked like fear before he locked it down behind irritation. Alara. Her name came out strangled. What the hell are you doing here? This is a closed executive session. You need to leave before I have security. Security works for building management. Her voice cut through his bluster like a scalpel. And as of 8 o'clock this morning, Vanguard Holdings purchased the deed to this tower, which means security works for me now. She walked forward, heels clicking against marble that she had crossed countless times as the invisible wife. The 2 men in dark suits entered behind her, taking positions flanking the doorway. One of them set a leather briefcase on the conference table with a deliberate thunk. Sienna Blackwell let out a sharp laugh from her seat near the windows. This is insane. Darian, called the police. Your crazy ex-wife is having some kind of breakdown. Preston Blackwell's hand shot up, silencing his daughter with a gesture. The old man's eyes had gone very sharp, tracking Alara's movement with the focus of a predator, recognizing another predator. He had survived 4 decades in finance by reading rooms faster than other men could process information, and whatever he saw in Alara's posture made him sit up straighter. Miss Whitmore. He used her maiden name with careful precision. You mentioned Vanguard Holdings. Alara stopped at the empty chair directly across from Darian. She didn't sit. She placed both hands flat on the glass table, leaning forward just enough to make her position unmistakable. I am the chief executive officer and majority shareholder of Vanguard Holdings. Yesterday afternoon, my firm finalized the acquisition of Nexus Data's entire corporate debt structure from your primary lenders. $520 million in principal plus accrued interest and penalties. The color drained from Darian's face so fast he looked like he might pass out. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. That's impossible. Vanguard is a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm. You don't have that kind of capital. You're living in Queens. I lived in Queens 5 years ago, Darian. Her tone carried the temperature of liquid nitrogen. When you handed me a $50,000 check and told me I was worth nothing. I've been busy since then. She nodded to one of the men at the door. He stepped forward and removed a thick stack of bound documents from his briefcase, sliding them down the table's glass surface until they stopped directly in front of Darian's hands. Those are the promissory notes, every loan you took out to finance your desperate acquisitions, every line of credit you over-leveraged trying to stop the bleeding when your clients started leaving. I own all of it. And because you missed 2 consecutive covenant benchmarks last quarter. She paused, letting the words sink in like poison. I'm executing the acceleration clause. Darian stared at the documents. His hands were trembling slightly as he picked up the top page. His eyes scanned the legal language. The bank seals the transfer signatures. Everything was authentic, real, binding. Acceleration clause. His voice had lost all its usual confidence, reduced to something small and lost. Preston Blackwell's face had gone from sharp interest to dangerous fury, but the anger wasn't directed at Alara. He turned to Darian with an expression that could have melted steel. It means the entire debt becomes due immediately, today, right now. $520 million to be precise. Alara's voice remained perfectly level. Payable by close of business at 5 p.m., or I force Nexus Data into immediate liquidation. I strip the assets, sell the intellectual property, and personally sue the board for gross fiduciary negligence in allowing this company to drown in debt while hemorrhaging clients. The boardroom erupted. Board members started shouting over each other, voices climbing in panic. Sienna stood up, face twisted in fury, screaming at Darian to do something. Preston slammed his hand on the table hard enough to rattle the water glasses. Alara waited. She had expected chaos, had planned for it. The fury of men who were watching their investments evaporate was predictable, controllable. She let them burn through the initial shock, let them scream themselves hoarse, and then she spoke again, quieter this time, which somehow made everyone go silent faster than shouting would have. Let's not do the hysterics. The phrase hit Darian like a physical blow. She watched him recognize his own words, the exact dismissive tone he had used the day she found him with Sienna. His face went gray. You can't do this. The words came out as a plea disguised as a demand. You're trying to destroy my company out of petty jealousy. This is illegal. This is extortion. Your company, Alara tilted her head slightly, a predator's gesture. Nexus Data has been dying for 2 years, Darian. You just didn't notice because you were too busy playing CEO to understand the machinery underneath. You've lost 63% of your enterprise clients. Your government contracts are gone. Your healthcare portfolio evaporated. Have you ever wondered why? Darian froze. A new kind of dread crept into his expression, something deeper than the fear of losing money. The fear of realizing you have been outmaneuvered so completely, you never even saw the game being played. You. His voice cracked on the single syllable. Phantom Systems. Alara let the name hang in the air. The firm that took the Department of Defense contract from you. The firm that convinced Wells Fargo and Kaiser Permanente and every other major client you had that your infrastructure was obsolete. That's my company, Darian. I built Sentinel Protocol. I engineered the technology that made your stolen code look like something from the previous century. Every client you lost over the past 3 years, I took them from you. Slowly, methodically, and you never had any idea who was beating you. Sienna gasped, sinking back into her chair. Preston Blackwell covered his face with both hands, a groan of pure frustration escaping his throat. The board members fell into stunned silence as the full scope of what had happened settled over them like a funeral shroud. Alara hadn't just bought their debt. She had orchestrated their collapse. She had been the invisible architect of Nexus Data's destruction, and they had been blind to it the entire time. You stole my intellectual property. Darian's voice was rising again, desperation giving way to anger. Phantom Systems is built on Nexus Data Code. I'll sue you. I'll take every cent you have. I'll destroy you in court. Alara reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a single folded document. She unfolded it with deliberate care and placed it on the table between them. This is a copy of our divorce settlement, specifically page 42. Your lawyer, Simon Thorne, drafted it very carefully. It states that I, Alara Whitmore, explicitly surrender any and all claims to the intellectual property of Nexus Data, recognizing that the code is solely your creation and that my contributions were, she glanced down at the text, negligible and without market value. Darian stared at the paper like it was a snake. Furthermore, Alara continued, her voice taking on the mechanical precision of someone reciting a death sentence. It includes a blanket waiver stating I have no rights to any assets or intellectual property generated during the marriage. You legally established in a court of law that my brain was not an asset to your company. Therefore, anything I built after the divorce is entirely and unambiguously mine. You built a legal fortress to keep me away from Nexus Data, Darian. You just forgot to make sure I couldn't build something better right next door. Simon Thorne, the lawyer who had destroyed her in the divorce proceedings, was sitting 3 seats down from Darian. His face had gone the color of old newspaper. Alara met his eyes briefly, and the recognition of his own perfect trap closing on his client made the man physically shrink in his chair. Simon, Darian's voice cracked with panic. Tell me she's wrong. Tell me there's a way out of this. Thorne swallowed hard, his legendary confidence evaporated. Darian, she owns the debt. The documentation is legitimate. And the IP waiver I drafted for the divorce, he couldn't finish the sentence. Fix it. Darian slammed both hands on the table. That's what I pay you for. Fix this. Preston Blackwell stood up slowly, buttoning his suit jacket with the careful movements of a man trying to maintain dignity in the face of catastrophe. He looked at Darian not with pity, but with contempt so pure it was almost beautiful. There's nothing to fix, you arrogant, incompetent fool. You told me the client losses were temporary market fluctuations. You told me you had the technical capability to compete with Phantom Systems. You didn't even know who was destroying you. He turned to Alara, his demeanor shifting instantly from rage to cold business calculation. Ms. Whitmore, you didn't come here just to bankrupt him. If you force liquidation, you'll get pennies on the dollar for the debt. You want something else. Alara had been waiting for this. Preston Blackwell was many things, but he wasn't stupid. I want Nexus Data, the brand, the remaining patents, the infrastructure, the client contracts. I want to absorb it into Phantom Systems. Impossible, Darian spat the word. I own 51% of the voting shares. You can't take the company without my consent. For now, Alara shifted her attention to Preston. Mr. Blackwell, you and the board control the remaining 49%. If you sign your voting rights over to Vanguard Holdings today, I will restructure the debt. I will absorb the losses. And I will ensure that the board members are bought out at 20 cents on the dollar. It's a brutal loss, I know. You'll each lose tens of millions. But if you fight me, I force bankruptcy. The company goes into Chapter 7 liquidation. The courts will pierce the corporate veil because of Darian's reckless mismanagement, and creditors will come after your personal assets. You'll lose everything, plus face SEC investigations into how you let this man drive your investments into the ground. Preston's jaw tightened. 20 cents on the dollar meant he would personally lose over $30 million. But bankruptcy would mean losing all of it, plus the very real possibility of federal fraud charges if investigators started digging into how much the board knew about Nexus Data's real financial condition. Sienna grabbed her father's arm. Dad, no. If you give her your shares, Darian loses control. We lose everything. The penthouse, You should have married a competent man, Sienna. Preston's voice was ice. He pulled his arm free from her grip and turned back to Alara. If I give you my proxy, what happens to him? He jerked his head toward Darian. If the board surrenders their share, I will offer Mr. Ashford a deal. He signs over his 51% transferring complete ownership of Nexus Data to me. In exchange, I will not force the company into bankruptcy, which means the corporate veil remains intact. His personal assets stay protected from creditors. And if I don't sign, Darian's voice was barely a whisper now. Alara leaned forward slightly, and when she spoke, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. If you don't sign, I call the debt at 5 p.m. Nexus data files for Chapter 7 by end of business today. The courts will pierce the corporate veil because of your documented mismanagement and fraud. Every offshore account, every piece of real estate, every asset you bought with money you claimed was yours alone, creditors will seize all of it. You'll walk out of this building with nothing, exactly like I did. The parallel was so perfect it felt like poetry. Darian looked frantically around the table, searching for allies, for someone who would stand with him. But the board members were already reaching for their expensive pens. They had spent 3 years watching Darian's arrogance bleed their portfolios dry. Whatever loyalty they might have once felt had died with their stock value. Preston Blackwell collected the signed proxies from each board member, walking around the table with the grim efficiency of a funeral director. When he had all 49% of the voting shares consolidated, he returned to his seat and slid the documents across to Alara. The board is yours, Ms. Whitmore. Alara didn't look at the papers. Her eyes were locked on Darian, watching the exact moment he understood that he was completely alone, that every person in this room had chosen their own survival over his. Well, Darian, she pushed a single-page document across the table toward him. It seems we're at a crossroads. Sign the company over to me, or I take everything else you have. Darian stared at the contract. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the pen someone had placed next to the paper. He looked at Sienna, desperate for anything that resembled support or love or partnership. Sienna was staring at her phone, already texting, not calling for help, arranging her exit strategy. The prenuptial agreement she had insisted on before their wedding protected her family's trust fund from Darian's debts. She was cutting the rope before the drowning man could pull her under. Sienna, he tried, voice breaking. She didn't look up. You're bankrupt, Darian. Actually, completely bankrupt. My prenup protects me from your liabilities. My lawyer will send the divorce papers by Friday. The betrayal on his face was almost satisfying, almost, but Alara felt nothing where satisfaction should have lived. Just the cold, mechanical completion of a 5-year equation. Sign the paper, Darian. He picked up the pen. His signature, usually a bold flourish he loved to display on press releases, came out as a shaky, defeated scrawl. He pushed the document back across the table like it burned his fingers. Alara took the signed contract and slid it into her portfolio. Thank you, a wise decision. Perhaps your first in 5 years. Something desperate flickered behind Darian's eyes, a final flailing attempt at control. He shoved his chair back, the legs screeching against marble. You think you've won. You don't get the offshore servers. You don't get the encryption keys. I can wipe the entire database right now. I can burn everything to the ground before your IT team figures out the passwords. He pulled his phone from his pocket, fingers trembling as he unlocked the screen. There was an application he had commissioned 3 years ago, a master override system that gave him God-level access to every Nexus data server worldwide. An emergency self-destruct he had built in case of hostile takeover or government seizure. If he couldn't have his empire, nobody would. His thumb found the application icon. Red warning text filled the screen. Critical system override. Authorized data purge. Below it, a confirmation button glowed like a promise of mutual destruction. Alara watched him hover over the button. She didn't move to stop him, didn't call for the security guards, just waited with an expression that might have been pity if you looked at it from the right angle. Go ahead. Darian pressed the button. The screen flashed, then went black. Then displayed a message in cold white text: access denied. Credentials revoked by system administrator. Darian stared at the phone. He pressed the button again. Same message. Again. Again. His movements became frantic, desperate, the actions of a man watching his last weapon turn to dust in his hands. Did you really think, Alara's voice was soft now, almost gentle, that I would let you hold a match anywhere near my property? She straightened, smoothing the front of her suit jacket. I told you, Darian, Nexus data runs on my architecture. Even the upgrades your developers patched together over the past 5 years were built on top of my foundational code. And there was something in that foundation. A debugging subroutine I wrote 7 years ago to help me test changes during development. A backdoor I meant to remove before launch, but you were rushing to meet the IPO deadline, and I never got around to cleaning it up. She walked slowly around the table, stopping a few feet from where Darian stood frozen. 4 years ago, when I was building Phantom systems, I found it. Still there, still dormant, still waiting for someone who knew the right encryption keys. At 8:01 this morning, exactly 1 minute after Vanguard Holdings took possession of this building, my lead engineer executed a script through that back door. Your access to the mainframe, the offshore servers, your corporate email, even your digital parking pass, all of it was revoked. You don't control anything anymore. You never really did. Darian dropped his phone. It clattered against the marble floor, the screen spiderwebbing with cracks. The sound seemed to echo forever in the silent boardroom. The realization that he hadn't just lost today, that he had been outplayed for years, that every move he made had been anticipated and countered by someone he thought he had destroyed, broke something fundamental in his posture. His shoulders sagged. His expensive suit suddenly looked like a costume worn by someone playing a role they no longer understood. It's over, Darian. Preston Blackwell stood adjusting his tie with brisk efficiency. Have some dignity and leave. He turned to Alara, offering a stiff nod that contained more respect than affection. Mr. Whitmore, this was ruthless. I'm not sure whether to be impressed or terrified. I look forward to reading about Phantom Systems expansion in the journal. Preston walked toward the door. Sienna scrambled to follow him, not sparing a single glance back at the man she had married for connections and money, both of which had just evaporated. Sienna, wait. Darian's voice cracked on her name. She paused at the doorway, looking back at him with eyes that held nothing. Not love, not anger, not even contempt. Just the empty assessment of someone realizing they had bet on the wrong horse. My lawyer will contact yours about the divorce. Don't call me Darian. Don't come to the penthouse. It's under my father's LLC anyway, so I suggest you collect your things by tonight. Consider this your notice. She walked out. The scent of her perfume, the same expensive fragrance that had clung to her the day Alara found them together, faded into the sterile air. The other board members filed out in silence, none of them meeting Darian's eyes. Within 3 minutes, the boardroom had emptied except for Alara, her 2 security personnel, and Darian standing alone at the head of a table he no longer owned. Alara pressed a button on her watch. Less than 10 seconds later, the mahogany doors opened again. This time it wasn't board members. 3 men in tactical security uniforms entered, moving with the precise efficiency of professionals who had done this many times before. Mr. Ashford is no longer an employee of this company. Please escort him from the premises. He is not permitted to return to his office. His personal effects will be boxed and mailed to a forwarding address he can provide to HR. Wait, Darian's panic was raw now and filtered. I need my laptop, my files. My car keys are in my office. Your corporate laptop is company property, Alara corrected. And since this company leased your Mercedes Maybach through an executive vehicle program, those keys belong to me now as well. You can keep the suit you're wearing. That's yours. The security guards moved to flank Darian. He didn't resist as they placed firm hands on his shoulders and turned him toward the door. As they reached the threshold, Darian looked back one final time. He wanted to see hatred in Alara's face. Wanted to see the vengeful ex-wife he could tell himself this story was really about. It would have made the loss easier to process, would have let him be the victim of a woman scorned. But Alara wasn't looking at him anymore. She was already reviewing something on her tablet, swiping through spreadsheets with the focus of someone who had finished checking an item off a very long to-do list. He wasn't her obsession. He wasn't her nemesis. He was simply done. The guards guided him toward the elevator. Through the glass walls of the executive suite, employees looked up from their desks, watching their former CEO being escorted out like a criminal. Whispers spread through the office in visible waves. The elevator ride down felt like falling. Darian kept his eyes on the descending floor numbers, unable to look at his own reflection in the polished steel doors. When they reached the ground floor, the guards walked him through the lobby, the same lobby where he had held court for 7 years, where employees had scrambled to impress him, where he had felt like a king. They pushed through the revolving doors and deposited him on the sidewalk of Fifth Avenue. The November wind cut through his $3,000 suit like it was made of paper. Darian stood on the concrete shivering as the midday crowd flowed around him with the indifference of a river around a stone. He dug into his pockets and found a $20 bill and a Metro card with maybe 2 rides left on it. He looked up at the tower, 42 floors of glass and steel reaching into the gray sky. At the very top in the executive suite, he thought he saw a figure standing at the window. But from this distance, with the winter sun reflecting off the glass, it was impossible to tell if anyone was there at all. 8 months later, the transformation was complete. The ostentatious Nexus data sign that had dominated the Manhattan skyline, blue neon visible for blocks, a monument to Darian's ego, had been systematically dismantled. In its place was a sleek, minimalist logo in ice blue light, Phantom Systems. Inside the penthouse office that had once belonged to Darian Ashford, Ilara stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows looking down at the city that had tried to break her and failed. The room bore no trace of its previous occupant. Gone were the ostentatious leather sofas and pop art prints. In their place was an ultra-modern command center, curved holographic displays showing real-time data flow across Phantom Systems' global network, minimalist furniture in whites and grays, a massive desk made from a single piece of reclaimed steel. The heavy doors opened. Grayson Hale walked in, tablet in hand, wearing an expression of satisfied amusement. "You skipped the Blackwell Charity Gala last night." Preston spent half the evening cornering me, practically begging for an early investment window into our Series C funding round. Ilara turned from the window. "Let him beg. We don't need his capital. With Nexus Data's infrastructure fully integrated, we're cash flow positive. We crossed $7 billion in market cap yesterday. 7.2 as of market close." Hale settled into one of the chairs. "Speaking of closures, did you see the final SEC ruling?" "I saw the headlines. They eviscerated him. Forensic accountants found everything. The fraudulent revenue projections, the off-balance sheet loans. Lifetime ban from serving as an officer or director of any public company." Hale paused. "He avoided federal prison by turning state's witness against 3 board members. Kept him out of a cell, but destroyed what was left of his reputation." Ilara felt nothing. The information registered as data points, nothing more. "What about Sienna?" Hale actually laughed. "Her prenup protected her trust fund, but Preston was so furious about losing $30 million that he placed her finances under conservatorship. She's living in a 2-bedroom condo in Boca Raton on a monitored budget, driving a leased Honda. Her entire lifestyle brand collapsed." "Appropriate." Hale pulled a printed email from his jacket. "One more thing. This came through the corporate contact form this morning." Ilara read it slowly, her expression unchanging. "Ilara, I know I have no right to contact you. I lost everything. I'm working as a shift supervisor at a logistics warehouse in Newark now. 2-hour commute each way on the bus. I can barely make rent. I know I made mistakes, but we used to be a team. We built Nexus Data together. I understand the legacy systems better than anyone. I'm begging you, I need a job, even a low-level consulting position. Please, I have nowhere else to go." Darian, she dropped the paper into the recycling bin beside her desk. "Silence is the only answer he deserves, but I want you to do one thing." Hale raised an eyebrow. "Send him a severance package, a cashier's check for exactly $50,000. Have legal draft the settlement agreement using the exact same template Thorne used for my divorce papers. Same font, same condescending language. Everything." Hale stared at her for a moment before a slow smile spread across his face. "Poetic symmetry. I'll have it couriered to his warehouse this afternoon." He stood buttoning his jacket. "You built something extraordinary, Ilara, and say, not just the company. What you built inside yourself, the discipline to stay invisible for 5 years, the patience to let him destroy himself. That's rarer than genius. Thank you, Grayson, for believing in me when I had nothing. You never had nothing, you just temporarily misplaced your understanding of your own value." After he left, Ilara stood alone in her office at the apex of the empire she had built from rage and genius. She walked to her desk and opened the bottom drawer, pulling out the battered MIT laptop that had started everything. She powered it on, listening to the familiar whir of the old fan. Navigated to the directory containing her original Nexus data code, the architecture she had written while Darian slept. Then she navigated to a different folder, the one containing Sentinel Protocol source code. The code she had written for herself by herself with no illusions about partnership or shared success. It was objectively superior in every measurable way. Built by someone who had learned that if you were going to pour your soul into something, it better have your name on it. She closed the laptop with a quiet click. Her phone buzzed. A message from Kira Tokyo office requesting call about Asia Pacific expansion. 3 enterprise clients ready to sign if we can guarantee Q2 deployment. Alara typed back, schedule for tomorrow. Include Alexei, we'll need his encryption expertise for their data protection compliance. She set down the phone and looked around her office one final time. At the holographic displays showing Phantom Systems' reach expanding across continents. At the Forbes cover on the wall, the woman who won by disappearing. At the physical evidence that she had not just survived betrayal, but had used it as raw material to build something extraordinary. Somewhere in Newark, Darian was probably finishing a shift at a warehouse. He would receive a check for $50,000 in a few days and understand exactly what it meant. The equation had balance. The scales were even. And Alara Whitmore felt nothing about that man except the profound relief of no longer caring. The holographic displays flickered with new data. Phantom Systems stock had jumped another 3% in after-hours trading. Somewhere analysts were writing reports about the company's trajectory. Business schools were studying her tactics. Young engineers were dreaming about getting hired. Alara picked up her phone and made the call to Tokyo, her voice steady and certain. Outside the windows, Manhattan glittered in the gathering dusk, a city of 8 million stories. Each one a battle being fought, an empire being built, a lesson being learned about trust and betrayal, and the price of underestimating the quiet ones who work while you sleep. She had won, not because she destroyed Darian Ashford that had been incidental. She won because she learned to value her own genius more than anyone else's approval. And that lesson was worth more than any company, any revenge, any victory that depended on someone else's defeat.